According to Einstein's theory of special relativity, time is an illusion. The physicists describe time as a fourth dimension. It is simply another coordinate within the equation. Time conventionally moves forwards, making everyone by default a time traveller. However, I know what it means when those coordinates change and time moves backwards. For any normal person, the phrase a lifetime is often used to describe an undesirably long period of time. It's a simple exaggeration anyone can use. Oftentimes, it's the length of someone's life, which is much more accurate. Lifetimes can be long or short, they can be messy and confusing, or they can be refreshing and full of excitement. That, however, is down to the person who owns said lifetime. Every generation tells the next to live life to the fullest, to reach out and grab every opportunity as if it's the last of its kind. Out of everyone who has heard this wisdom, how many have really done so? One thing many people are terrified of is regret. They have this lingering fear in the back of their consciousness, whispering to them that they'll regret their actions, that they'll regret not taking the chances served to them. Until today, regret had been a foreign concept to me. I've never stopped long enough to consider the movements I've made, the opportunities I've turned down or promises I may have broken. It wasn't until this very moment that as I watched everything crumble before my very eyes, that I began to regret everything I've ever done. I think it's impossible for me to do so. That would mean regretting him. Charles Hopkins was an uptight know-it-all, with a strong desire to follow the road set out before him. He obeyed every rule and avoided trouble as though it were the plague. His biggest downfall was saying no. To me, at least. I met Charlie the first time I travelled. I'd been wandering around an empty field with my grandmother's empty radio in hand for the best part of an hour when I came to a stop before him. He must have been watching me as I circled the grass. I know he'd never admit it, but he found my confusion amusing. Near London, he'd answered when I'd asked him where we were, and it wasn't that I didn't believe him, but there was something about the way he spoke. Maybe it was his accent, or maybe it was his manners, but something told me I wasn't anywhere near home. I'd sat down beside him then, sitting silently as he continued to write. He didn't ask any questions, and he didn't ask me to leave. Instead, he seemed unfazed, as though my sudden appearance were an everyday occurrence. He never did ask where I came from, but he found out eventually. While we didn't speak much at first, Charlie seemed to sense that I needed someone there, that I had come from far away and needed a companion within this new environment. It didn't take long for us to become friendly, for my silent questions to be answered and Charlie's silence to grow loud. As the days crept past, we became close, and most afternoons were spent out in the same field, just talking quietly. Charlie told me about his family, about his girlfriend, and the dreadful job he maintained at the local bookshop. He helped me fit in, he lent me clothes, filled me in on all the gossip, and introduced me to the locals, most of whom were very friendly towards me. All of this came at a price though. Charlie wanted to know my story, and he wanted to understand how I claimed to be from the future. So every evening, as our long afternoons lazing out in the sun came to an end, Charlie would pull out his notebook and I would begin to talk. I didn't have a lot to tell him, but whether I was talking about boring old politics or the new music festival I went to last summer, he never failed to look fascinated. As the evenings wore on, Charlie's scribbles became more frantic, as though he wanted to note down everything I said. At first, I never paid any attention to his actions, just happy to talk about my struggles with someone who had the outside perspective to end all outside perspectives. However, as time went on and I ran out of things to say, I began to wonder exactly what it was he was writing. Notes, he had told me with a shrug, as if that were all they were and all they could ever be. It wasn't until something truly went wrong that I grew to realise they would serve as something much more important. Although I had proven otherwise, time continued to move onwards and forwards, and before either me or Charlie could consider it, the Second World War was upon us. I knew a lot about the wars, for I had sat through many a history lesson, but looking back now, I had every opportunity to warn Charlie and prepare him for the horrors that would come. I didn't though. And maybe that is the first thing I regret. I'm not sure. I had taken every opportunity to ramble about my own personal downfalls and worries, so much so that I didn't see the chance to warn my best friend about possibly the biggest downfall he'll ever live through. Of course, being the heroic saviour he was, Charlie enlisted. From the get-go, he had tried to convince me to join him, claiming that we could lie, produce fake documents, and join the war effort together. Charlie had this grand scheme planned out, a way for me to finally settle in and prove myself to everyone we knew. I, however, never considered this an option. Charlie had looked so smart the day he left, but when had he ever looked anything but? With his hair styled, his shirt pressed, and his mother took a photo, he stood straight and proud with not an ounce of regret in his eyes as he walked by on his way to battle. Maybe that was the second thing I regretted, not joining him. I could have kept him safe out there, maybe even protected him with my limited knowledge. It was better than nothing, yet I chose to deprive him of that, instead filling his small booklet with just nonsense. After Charlie left, everything changed. The kind smiles from those around me faded into distaste. I should have been out there, fighting for our country, their country. It had never truly been my country though. My country was a society 80 years into the future, but no one but myself and Charlie would ever understand that. It was about 3 months after Charlie left that I did the one thing I will never forgive myself for. I ran. When most people run away, they leave town or simply take a walk before returning home. Now I considered returning home, not to Charlie's home, but my home. The only problem was that the prospect of facing everything I'd ever left behind was almost as intimidating as staying in the past. So I chose a middle ground. I didn't want to run to either home. Instead, I settled for almost 60 years into the future. It was a lot easier to settle in this time around. Everything was familiar, and I found it easier to blend in with people my own age. It was here that I met Gracie. I met her on a night out. I was with some of the boys I'd met the day before when I stumbled across her waiting at the bus stop. I let the group go ahead and stopped to speak to her. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I needed to get to know her, to talk to her. In that moment, I was sure that if my time with Charlie had taught me anything, it was that I needed to take every opportunity and not look back. Gracie was everything I'd ever looked for. She was smart, funny, and carefree. We had fun together, simply just being young. It was everything Charlie should have had before the war had stripped him of that freedom. After a few years, I decided that I could trust Gracie enough to explain everything. I told her how I'd come to join her in the 90s and how I'd spent years before in the 30s. She seemed as enthusiastic as Charlie had been, although her excitement was much more louder. Instead of waiting for me to continue in silence, she just asked questions, and instead of just sitting and listening, we danced. It was our favourite pastime, dancing. Though not the loud rave kind of the times, it was instead the warm, intimate kind. The kind you do in the rain when you don't mind your hair getting wet, or the kind you do in the sand as you avoid the waves. I think that was when I really began to recognise my regret. I was living. For the first time ever, I was living my honest and truthful existence. Yet I had deprived the person who taught me how of that same liberty. It was Gracie's idea to go back to Charlie. She didn't mean permanently though. Instead, she was offering me the chance to fix my mistakes, to warn him, and to convince him to join us. At first I wasn't sure, but once I'd been given the chance to bring Charlie back into my life, I began to realise that I couldn't pass by this opportunity like I had everything else. So I went. I took the old radio once more and I tuned it just right so that I found myself back in that field. I knew that my calculations had been precise, for Charlie was nowhere to be seen, but the previous version of myself was sat asleep on the hill. I don't remember a lot from that day, but I do remember the overwhelming, suffocating feeling that came with the desperation I felt. I don't remember stopping to read the date on a newspaper, and I don't remember the strange looks I received as I made my way down the road. The one thing that stands out the most from that day, though, was how I was just in time to stop him. If I had made it just a few days later, he would have left me all over again. I'm not sure what I had expected from that day, but it wasn't to be met with resistance. I'll never know if Charlie had known it was me, the older version of myself that is, but I'd like to think he did. I don't think I could ever regret anything more than I do that day. My decision to go back and get Charlie will forever be the greatest mistake I've ever made, and I'll have to live with that choice for the rest of my life. Charlie's refusal was like a slap in the face. He had always enjoyed his life. He had a road planned out in front of him and he was eager to follow it. He always had been. My journey back that day did in fact influence Charlie's decision. However, it did so in the worst way. As I discovered upon returning to Gracie, Charlie had hesitated. He had waited a few days longer than enlisting, and as a result he was put in with a different group of men. The same group of men that were going to be killed in action. People live in fear that they'll reach the end of their lives and look back with regret. They spend every day trying to make the most out of life to avoid this, yet in 40, 50 or 60 years time they will still look back with regrets. Regret is a normal part of life, and I find that if you act on it, you will only live to regret it more. Up until today, I could count on one hand of things I regret, but looking back, I regret everything. I regret not talking to Charlie more. I regret not warning him, not helping him. I regret not asking what his notebook meant. I've since found out that they were reports of everything I said, which did in fact make up advice Charlie could follow into the future. I just didn't know it yet. It was in those few moments that I lived in the present, where I merely existed with no strings attached, that I actually have the biggest impact. So this is my report for Charlie, and anyone else currently living through time. You don't need to go anywhere to time travel, for you are doing so right now, every second of every minute of every single day. The best way to experience life is without looking forwards and without looking back. For if you look back, you will only see your mistakes, and if you look forward, you'll spend so long trying to avoid the mistakes where you won't realise you are actually making them. Just exist. That is all you can ask of yourself. Just exist.